Welcome back, guys, from the ad break. Trust that you're feeling refreshed and that you've kind of had some opportunity to reflect on what we've just done. In this segment, we're looking at the response of plants in response to different stimuli. It's important that we understand the concept of tropism, and then we're going to move on to looking at how different factors influence plant growth. So let's look at our lesson. What is tropism? The word tropism means to turn. A tropism is a response to an external stimulus causing a plant to grow towards or away from the stimulus. A growth movement towards the stimulus is positive, while a growth movement away from the stimulus is negative. Now, having understood the concept of tropism, we need to understand that there are parts of the plant that grow towards the stimulus and parts of a plant that grow away from a stimulus. A typical example would be that when a plant grows towards the light, it is attracted towards the stimulus. However, the roots tend to grow in the opposite direction. So we say that the leaves are positively phototrophic. In this case, phototropism, they are attracted towards light. And then the roots are negatively phototrophic, and meaning they move away from that. So when we understand the context of a positive stimulus, we know that it's a direction in which they're moving towards, and then a negative stimulus would be a response in the opposite direction. So let's remember that when we look at these hormones. A tropism takes place as a result of an unequal distribution of auxins in the plant. Certain plants will grow faster than others. Now, it's important that at this point we recognize, I've got an example of a bamboo shoot here, and if you look at it, it's essentially taken quite a unique shape. And this shape shows you that there's been some direction change in the growth of this stem. So initially this was growing horizontal to the ground, and then the stimulus of light changed, and you'll find that the stem began to turn. So essentially it's important that we recognize that when the plant stem was growing along this horizontal axis, that the auxins were produced in the opposite direction against the direction of the stimulus, which caused the elongation towards the stimulus. However, when the source of light changed, you found that the stem now changed direction and the auxins moved in the opposite direction, causing the elongation in the direction of the stimulus. So essentially, the auxins move in the opposite direction from the stimulus, causing an elongation in the direction in which the stimulus is coming from. Okay, so I'm going to get back to this example in a bit. Let's talk about the concept of phototropism. The word phototropism essentially is derived from light. So phototropism is the growth movement of the part of a plant in response to a unilateral direction of light. So the term unilateral essentially is if you had a source of light and that light was being directed towards an object, that is a unidirectional form of light. So it's not dispersed. We're saying that it is only in one specific direction that the light is being expressed. So that is a unidirectional direction of light. Stems and leaves usually grow towards the light to absorb the maximum amount of sunlight, so that photosynthesis is therefore positively phototrophic. When the growing tip of the stem receives the light, which is from one direction, we find that the light-sensitive auxins move away from that light towards the shaded side. Let's look at this in a simple diagram. So here we're seeing, in this example, we're looking at the stimulus of light coming in one direction. At the tip of this plant, we have the apical buds, and we notice that there is auxins that are produced around that area. Due to the light stimulus being from the vertical position, the auxins will tend to move away from that stimulus of light in the opposite direction. And as they move in the opposite direction, it causes an elongation of the apical area in the direction of the stimulus, and this further increases the length of the plant in terms of its height. So what is important is that the auxins diffuse down the shoot, stimulating the growth away from the source of the auxins. So as I mentioned, the auxins move down this way and causing the meristematic tissue to divide and therefore increasing the height of the plant. Let's look at what happens when the light comes from a different direction. So here we've changed the direction of the light, and we notice that if the one side of the shoot is stimulated with light, the auxins diffuse in the opposite direction. So here we're seeing that the auxins coming in from one direction. You'll find that the light comes in from one direction. We find that the auxins now accumulate in the opposite side. So that's where the auxins tend to accumulate. And this accumulation of the auxins causes an increase in the growth of cells in this region. And hence we find that now the tip tends to bend or increase in length in this direction. So we find, as I've mentioned in this example, if I hold this up, you can see that now the auxins are being produced in this opposite direction from the stimulus of light, and this causes an elongation in that area, and hence you find that this tends to bend towards the stimulus of light as the auxins accumulate here and stimulate cell division by mitosis in that area. So this is a classical example, a living example of how a plant now has moved towards a source of light and changed its direction and growth of the plant. We also need to recognize that the concept of geotropism is present and experienced by plants. Geo comes from the word gravity in response to the gravitational stimulus. So geotropism is the growth of a plant or parts of the plant in response to a unilateral gravitational stimulus. Now, we all experience gravity, which is a natural phenomenon. Plants also experience this gravity. So, essentially, if you look at this example again, you can clearly see that in a plant, the roots will positively grow down into the ground. What does that mean? It means that the stimulus of gravity is a stimulus that attracts the plant in that direction. It means that in this plant, you'll find that the seedlings also placed down will produce roots towards the soil. And you'll find that the leaves tend to grow up, or the shoots tend to grow up against gravity. So roots are positively geotrophic and negatively phototrophic. Okay, so let's hold on to that thought and let's look at this in an experiment. Okay, the auxins accumulate towards the lower side of the root due to gravity. The higher concentrations of auxins on the lower side will cause the elongation in this region. We find that the cells on the upper side of the root then begin to divide, and you'll find that growth occurs faster in the vertical direction. The roots also curve downwards, so they are positively geotrophic. Here I have an illustration where we've got that plant that is placed in a horizontal orientation. Okay, if we look at this, we see that the plant is laid on its side and the auxins gather in the lower part of the stem and root. So the plant is placed along a horizontal surface, and at the bottom of that we see the accumulation of the auxins. How does this influence the development of the meristematic tissue? Interesting. We see now that the auxins, this slows the growth in the roots, so that the roots begin to turn downward. So we see that the roots now from that position begin to turn in the opposite direction and move down into the soil. However, the auxins in the tips of the plants have moved against the direction of stimulus here, in this case light, and we'll find that the shoot tends to curve upwards, stimulating the growth of the tips of the apical buds towards light. And so we see this natural movement towards the light and the plant becoming vertical once again. We also experience stem geotropism, and this is where the auxins accumulate on the lower side of the stem due to gravity, as I showed you now, and the higher auxin concentration on the lower side stimulates the elongation in this region. The stem hence will curve upwards towards the light and against gravity. So guys, this is a simple experiment showing you what happens when a unilateral light is applied. In this experiment, we've got two plants exactly the same. The only difference is that one is present on a clinostat, and a clinostat is essentially a machine that allows for this to constantly rotate or turn. In this experiment, the clinostat is switched off, and it means that this plant is not moving. What happens is that, this is a moving clinostat and this is the stationary one, and we see that as time progresses that the plant that is stationary tends to move towards the source of light. So this natural bending means that the auxins are moving in the opposite direction, causing the elongation in that direction. However, in our control, which has the moving clinostat, we find that this plant constantly turns. The unidirectional source of light is available to all parts equally, and this in turn will stimulate just the growth of the plant vertically. We also can see that in seeds, and we can express this in seeds where we see geotropism occurring in a similar way. So here we've got in the control a revolving clinostat which is constantly turning, and here we've got in the experiment we've got a stationary clinostat. These seeds are placed in specific directions, and you would notice that the germinating seeds all tend to grow towards gravity in this direction. So the roots are bending towards gravity, whereas the apical stems or radicals tend to grow against gravity. So this is an example of how gravity influences the growth of roots and how the auxins influence the growth of the stems or the radicals and the plumule. So guys, that's essentially a wrap of how hormones influence the growth of plants, and we referred to that as tropism. We've looked at the effect of light, phototropism. We've looked at the effect of gravity, geotropism, and that's a wrap for this section. A little break, and I'll see you at the end of that.